One of the most famous potential victims of the colour green is a little-known person by the name of Napoleon. He's exiled in the middle of the Atlantic, and shortly after his arrival there, he dies. It turns out that his room was papered in a very vibrant green wallpaper containing a pigment called Scheele's green, which actually contains very large quantities of arsenic.
Today, we take color for granted. But throughout history, obtaining certain colors has been elusive, challenging, and often dangerous.
The more I've researched colour, the more I've written about colour, the more I've seen the extreme lengths that people have gone to in order to get their hands on the best, the brightest colours.
Today, we're ranking how hard colors were to acquire in the ancient world, starting with the most common hues to the rarest shades that were worth more than gold.
This is the rise of civilization. A series where past worlds are brought back to life through the power of AI. Sometimes the AI nails it, and sometimes it doesn't. But either way, it lets us picture how the past built the present in a brand new way.
The first colour that it's important to talk about when you're talking about the influence that ancient colour has had on the present day is black. Black is one of humanity's first colours because one of the most popular and long-lasting black pigment comes from fire. Once you're able to create fire consistently, you are able to create soot and you're able to create a really steady, reliable, beautiful source of black. A really plentiful, easy colour to get hold of. I think our idea of black now is often tinged with death and with mourning. But as with a lot of colours, there's a strange duality with black because, of course, out of death and destruction and darkness also comes life and rebirth.
When ranking these colors, we're asking 4 questions. How rare was the source material? How difficult was it to process? How toxic was it to work with? And how brilliant and long-lasting was it? We'll rank them as either easy, tricky, challenging, difficult, or impossible. So black really wasn't that hard to achieve, so it's getting ranked as easy.
So having talked a little bit about black, we're moving to brown, which is, funny enough, also associated with common people, with the everyday. Brown is really not very difficult or dangerous or expensive to capture. As any person who has had experience with a colouring set knows, you start adding various different shades together and sooner or later you're going to end up with brown. And I think the place where you see that most clearly is in Japanese culture. During the 17th and 18th centuries, what they decreed was that only ordinary people had to wear brown, and the higher echelons of society, the nobility, clergy, they were able to wear really bright colours. But taking this law, taking this edict, they turn it into something amazing. They create many dozens of different shades of brown with subtle gradations, subtle changes of colour and tone, and really it becomes this incredible source of pride and creativity.
Brown, like black, wasn't very hard to acquire. Also easy.
So having talked about a couple of dark colours, we're now going to talk about, the lightest colour. White, it's relatively common. However, there is a major drawback. It's poisonous.
Lead white was the most prized white in the ancient world. To make it, artisans suspended lead sheets over vinegar in sealed pots. The fumes corroded the metal into a white crust that was scraped off and ground into powder. It was toxic, labor-intensive, and absolutely brilliant. The standard for painting, cosmetics, and more.
You may notice that Queen Elizabeth I has very pale skin. This was very fashionable at the time, and this could be really poisonous. You start to develop symptoms of lead poisoning, problems with reproduction and miscarriages and so on. So the thing about white in a dirty world is that very soon it starts looking not so white. The maintenance of white cloth also becomes a real significant indicator of your wealth, that you are able to afford to change your cloth relatively regularly, but it also indicates that you have staff and soap so you can clean the cloth. So the white fabric itself is telegraphing an awful lot.
Lead white was common enough, but given its toxic nature, we're bumping it up to tricky.
It's really funny to think how we are often surrounded by green. We might think of it as kind of being a color of abundance, and yet there's a real irony in there, because actually for artists and dyers, green has often been a really difficult and elusive color to make. And when you do make it, the chances are that it will disappear or fade or discolor. But even the green in nature, even the green leaves, often don't last very long. It can be incredibly expensive, and it can also be dangerous. A lot of the more reliable, vibrant green pigments that are discovered later on are really dangerous to your health. One of the most famous potential victims of the color green is a little-known person by the name of Napoleon. He's exiled on a very damp island in the middle of the Atlantic. He becomes ill, and shortly after his arrival there, he dies. Almost immediately, the British are suspected of having poisoned him. It turns out that his room was papered in a very vibrant green wallpaper containing a pigment called Scheele's green, which actually contains very large quantities of arsenic. Because the island was so damp, the action of all this damp air on this green could have been to create significant amounts of arsenic-laden gas in the rooms in which he was living. Some colours still have ill effects on us if they're ingested, or even if we're exposed to them for too long periods of time, and yet we continue to use pigments that may not be very good for us at all.
Capturing green was tough, but not impossible. Once acquired, it had all the downsides. It was toxic and would fade over time.
Orange. It's a color that really draws attention. In ancient times, with orange, you've got a range of options. It can be relatively easy, inexpensive, and safe, but it can also be quite difficult and arduous and expensive to get hold of. So when you're looking at the most expensive end of orange, you're probably looking at what we now think of as a spice called saffron.
Saffron orange colored Buddhist monk robes, and it still does today. It also colored Cleopatra's bathwater.
Saffron is an incredibly expensive spice. It remains so today, and it always has been. Getting access to it, making sure that we could use it as a dye or a colorant, or indeed as a spice, took an awful lot of resources.
Each purple crocus flower produced just 3 tiny stigmas. It took 150,000 flowers to make 1 kilogram of saffron. Saffron was so precious that forgery was punishable by death.
If you can't get your hands on saffron, and lots of people couldn't, there are alternatives. One of the most prominent is another spice that we commonly use in cooking today, which is turmeric. It also gives a very beautiful orange color, but for a fraction of the price. And so it's used to symbolize similar kind of things to saffron, but at a much cheaper price point, a much more accessible level.
Saffron orange was non-toxic and long-lasting. Its immense value mostly came from how challenging it was to acquire.
We associate it with the sun, with happiness, with good fortune. We tend to think of yellow very similarly in some ways and have a lot of the same associations that people did in ancient times. Yellow is a really wonderful color with a very particular history relating to China. For many centuries, yellow in China was associated with imperial power, and at times laws were passed restricting yellow purely to the imperial family. It could be phenomenally difficult and dangerous and expensive to make.
The most brilliant yellows were made from orpiment, essentially arsenic, toxic, deadly, and incredibly coveted.
And the reason why this particular shade of yellow became so symbolic is because of the 5 elements theory, which held great prominence in Chinese cosmology. This associated different elements, different colors with different ideas. Yellow was the color of the center. It was the color of the dragon. It symbolized stability, peace. And this became associated with imperial power because, of course, the emperor was also meant to represent the center, the heart of Chinese society. And of course, misusing it, using it when you weren't part of the imperial family, could come with grave repercussions.
Imperial yellow was a demanding color. It was rare, toxic, and very challenging to make. We're ranking it as difficult.
I think because its power is so self-evident. Red is one of my favorite colors to talk about. You can see the appreciation and the desire for red as far back as human records go. Exactly what they meant to the people who are using them can be quite difficult to disentangle. But with what we do know, we can see that red is used as allusions to blood, to life, power, and to wealth, because good sources of red were often quite difficult to get hold of.
For centuries, the ancient world had red. Ochre from iron-rich earth, madder root from plants, toxic cinnabar from mercury mines. These reds were accessible, but they were dull, inconsistent, or dangerously unstable. Then came cochineal.
If you're trying to really tell a story about red's power globally, the place where you have to start is probably Mesoamerica. Cochineal red is made from a particular type of scale insect that is very tiny, very inconspicuous looking, and is a voracious consumer of prickly pears. However, despite the fact that each individual scale insect might not look like much, the color that comes from them, carmine, is a gold mine. And if you squish these bugs, they produce a vibrant red dye, the principal ingredient of which is caminic acid. These insects and this dye is so valuable, it's essentially used as a currency. When you look at records of Aztec and Inca culture, you can see that taxes are being paid in sackfuls of these insects. And it's also something that really attracts the Spanish when they come over to take resources away from America to fund their own empire. For the Spanish, this became a very important source of wealth. The second most valuable thing they were gaining from the Americas, second only to silver. They kept very tight control, and they really didn't want anyone else getting access to it. We still actually use the coccus index and the carminic acid in foodstuffs today.
Controlling red meant controlling wealth, status, and empire itself. Cochineal was extremely hard to acquire.
There is this kind of idea that the ancient people didn't see blue because it's relatively common knowledge that lots of languages don't have a specific word for the color blue. So, for example, in ancient Greece, they didn't have a separate word for blue, which is why you get that phrase from Homer, wine dark sea. However, there are ancient cultures in which blues do play a really important role. One of the most famous is in ancient Egypt. They loved the color blue, it was very important to them. And they also managed to create a vibrant, long-lasting source of blue through really quite sophisticated chemistry.
Made from a mixture of silica, lime, and copper.
It has to be kind of created in a kiln at very high temperatures, between 800 and 1,000 degrees centigrade. It has to be fired twice, it's a very sort of pernickety process. They went to an awful lot of trouble, but for them, it was worth it. Egyptian blue was really sort of humanity's first synthetic pigment.
But Egyptian blue wasn't the only blue that demanded extraordinary effort.
A really classic example is the beautiful ultramarine pigment, which was made from a semi-precious stone called lapis lazuli. For the vast majority of history, the principal source of lapis lazuli comes from pretty much a single mine in northeastern Afghanistan. Very difficult to reach, huge amount of labor, and huge distances that this pigment has to travel to get to its final destination. And at every stage, people are making money off it. And so it becomes more and more and more and more and more expensive as it takes this great journey. So by the end, of course, it's worth huge amounts of money. It's worth so much, in fact, that people who are commissioning artists to create works of art are literally drawing up contracts to tell the artist how much of a canvas should be this particular color so that they won't get, stiff.
Blue required innovation, chemistry, and access to resources most civilizations simply didn't have.
So now coming to definitely the last color, but also definitely far from the least, we're talking about purple. The principal source of purple for the ancient world came from a really unlikely place, which is a couple of types of mollusk that are native to the Mediterranean. You'd have to go and find these sea snails, gather them up, crush them, and you'd be able to squeeze a couple of drops of liquid out of a particular gland that they have running across their backs. It requires a fair amount of processing. You have to use really nasty smelling ingredients like rotting shellfish and stale urine in order to create a beautiful dye.
The ancient cities of Tyre and Sidon built their entire economies on this reeking purple industry. But here's why civilizations obsessed over it. Tyrian purple was permanent. Unlike plant dyes that faded, this color deepened with age and sunlight. It was the only color that got more vibrant over time.
And it really comes to symbolize power for the ancient world centering around the Mediterranean. It's beloved by the Roman Empire, it's beloved by Byzantium, but this is really bad news for the sea snails. It takes around 15,000 individual sea snails to create an ounce of dye. So the population of sea snails plummets, which only makes the dye more exclusive and expensive.
A pound of purple-dyed silk in Roman times cost roughly 3 pounds of gold. The room where Byzantine empresses gave birth was lined with purple stone. Cleopatra had the sails of her ships dyed purple, and Julius Caesar was the first Roman allowed to wear a fully purple toga.
Purple signals power in a way that very few other colors do.
In the ancient world, purple was more than a color. Capturing it was the most impressive achievement in the entire spectrum. Today, anyone can wear purple. A whole range of shades and hues are available, but that doesn't mean we've totally conquered color.
There are still problems with the colors that we have. Sometimes they are found to be toxic or poisonous or carcinogens, but sometimes also they are prey to very ordinary things like light. At the moment, there is no really fantastic, cheap, affordable, and light-fast source for the color red. And this is something that is fascinating and potentially very lucrative to scientists who are desperate to find a really good source of the color red. And perhaps the most prominent of the people sort of on the hunt for the billion-dollar red is a scientist called Mas Subramanian, who is actually also responsible for creating yin min blue. And this was the first new blue to have been created for 2 centuries. So if anyone can do it, maybe Mas Subramanian can do it.
I was so happy to discover the blue, but I want to see what can I do with this discovery? Can I go beyond the blue? Now we are looking for the red pigment in my lab.
I think that we like to believe that we're very sophisticated, and we like to imagine that ancient history and its ideas, its values are firmly in the past. But that is not the case. We are the inheritors of the world that the ancient civilizations created. And that includes idea about wealth, about exclusivity, power, and of course, about color.
Do you agree with our ranking? Is there a color missing that you wish we ranked? Be sure to let us know down in the comments.